In general, I'd say it is a huge symbol of Black excellence. Everything from the science that's displayed, to the fighting skill, to the fashion, to the sort of environment that they live in, all of them symbol a kind of Black excellence that I think that many audiences and Black community audiences in particular are really hungry to see on the screen. You know, we've gone through periods of like having a lot of content and images that represent Black communities and all their diversity, and specifically sort of the African diaspora and African roots of those communities, regardless of where they are in the world. But I think more recently we haven't seen as much as that. You know, my students still talk about, I taught a class on Black men and masculinities in adult education in the fall term of 2017. And my students still talked about the Cosby Show being an influential show for them, for positive images of Black families. I was kind of surprised at that this is 2018. You know, when was the Cosby Show? I think the 80s, the 1980s. Some of them were barely even born when it was first being broadcasted, but it's still, I guess, through all the ways that we can sort of view shows that have been archived, this show is influential to them. So they also mentioned that the Cosby Show represented a kind of excellence and sort of prosperity of Black families that they were hungry to see, of like the interactions between, you know, Cliff Huxtable and Claire Huxtable. So I think there's a lot of that in Black Panther too. A number of youth I know have talked about enjoying the interactions between Shuri and T'Challa. You know, Black Panther and his sister Shuri, and sort of the ways that they sort of teach each other, respect each other. Yeah, I think there's a lot of these interactions between brother and sister, brother and former lover, father and son, mother and son, and all of the sort of technology in Wakanda, all of the inventions that all are come to be symbols of Black excellence. And I think Black audiences are really hungry to see that. I think some of the obvious really reasons to celebrate the representations of young Black men in Black Panther are just the diversity and sort of non-stereotypical aspects of these images, right? Here are sort of proud, sort of African sort of characters or with African roots. Killmonger also has African roots, right? His father is was one of the part of the royal court of Wakanda. T'Challa himself obviously is from Wakanda. These are sort of two men that are really proud and sort of represent their identities as being of African descent really well, right? And in really sort of regal and really sort of non-stereotypical ways, right? Most of the film is not set in sort of an inner city, low-income neighborhood in urban environments, so that's significant as well. I think the fact that both T'Challa and Killmonger are said to embody sort of Black excellence in terms of their athleticism, in terms of their fighting ability, as well as in terms of their intellectual pursuits. These are both sort of highly intelligent men that have spent a lot of time on their schooling, even if that's not represented in the film. But they're both really smart. They're both in really good shape, right? They're both wise. I think T'Challa in particular really is a model in terms of how to treat women. He both respects the women, he lets women protect him when needs be, he fights for sort of his sister and Nakia and Okoye when he needs to, but he and his mother. So I think that they're really sort of good models around gender relations. I think they show a number of scenes in the film where they try to communicate with one another. That's not always sort of seen in Hollywood films, right? So I think a lot of that is really noteworthy. I think some of the challenges come when you compare Killmonger to T'Challa. right? And some of their motivations. There's been a lot of talk about that on the internet and Twitter and social media. The main issue being that, Killmonger grew up in the United States, as is depicted in the film, was essentially sort of not given the opportunity to grow up in Wakanda, has developed a lot of anger and resentment towards Wakandans, right, and Wakandan society, and really sort of relishes destroying so many parts of that society, right? When there's a part scene when he sort of burns all of the plants that have been infused with vibranium, right? That being one of the main ones, or kills or chokes one of the women that is in charge of tending that, right? Is willing to destroy like parts of the Wakandan palace and sort of kingdom. And so it kind of comes off, or could represent, a kind of callousness, a kind of destructive nature of African American people versus African people. And that sort of issues of black masculinity. And that's what a lot of people are sort of talking about. So I think there are some issues about the sort of black masculinity and the destructiveness sort of linked to T'Challa, who's African, and Killmonger, who's African American, right? But I think overall, sort of the fact that both of them are really intelligent, who have really value sort of being sort of smart, studying science, right, as well as sort of taking care of themselves physically, are two really important symbols, as well as the way also they interact with T'Challa in particular, the way he interacts with sort of the women in his life. I think one of the other things in terms of the representation of T'Challa and Killmonger and Wakanda in general is it really represents a kind of black future. A lot of the whole area of black futurities and sort of the imagining sort of Africa really at the forefront and sort of leading so much of technologically in our advances. I think that's something that we don't get to see. In particular, sort of men like T'Challa in particular being at the forefront of that, along with his sister and mother, right, and sort of the head of his guard. I think that's something that we don't often get to see. That's sort of a kind of representation that's really complex, nuanced, also forward-thinking, innovative. We talk so much about innovations. There's really a dearth of representations of African innovations, right? And the way that African men and women contribute to those innovations that we don't get to see in most Hollywood films. I mean, I think actually that brings up another really important issue, which is the representation of black women and African women in this film, right? I think those are also, Shuri, his sister, Okoye, the leader of his guard, Nakia, sort of his ex-lover, and a spy. These are all women that show such range in terms of strength, in terms of intelligence, in terms of wisdom, right? That you really get a full picture and a much more of a canvas of the possibilities of what it means to sort of grow up a black girl and black womanhood. I looked at a YouTube video of Ryan Coogler sort of breaking down the fight scene in the casino in Korea and what he was trying to represent. And I'm really impressed by the amount of thought that he gave to gender relations in this film, right? He really tried to show that when we talk about sort of femininity and masculinity, that these are really some false binaries, that really black women and black men embody both masculinity and femininity, right? On the 1 minute, sort of Nakia the spy is like really in some ways embodying a really dominant notion of what it means to be feminine, and at the other minute she's taking off the high heel and sort of using it to kind of show her strength and to fight off one of the people who's trying to like hurt her and her brother and Okoye, right? I think the same thing around sort of the idea of the wig, of wearing the wig, and Okoye is really proud of having shaved her head and sort of putting forth that image of what it means to be a Wakandan woman, an African woman, be strong and be feminine, but also primarily for her, be strong and a skilled fighter. So I think those representations are really important. Not to mention Shuri. Obviously, Shuri's one of the breakout stars of the film. Her portrayal as someone who is really invested and committed to excellence in science. She's the primary inventor. She's sort of the Q, as people were likening it to the sort of the Bond films, that sort of invents so much of the technology that Black Panther uses in a suit that is powering the city. So I think that there'll be lots to build on and to talk about in relation to black girls in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, sort of the STEM fields, as they say. I think Shuri can be a really powerful symbol of the possibilities of that. Popular media can really serve as important material for identity formation and identity development. It's very different. This is based on a comic book. It's Wakanda. It's a fictional nation. You know, it's a superhero film, right? So it kind of has some of those tropes and some of those limitations. But I think there's a lot of hope and possibility in going to see Black Panther and have it really be an inspiration for Black excellence and the development of that in terms of identity formation.